I would now like to introduce and invite Mr. Manish Dangi, CEO, CIO, Aditya Birla Sun Life AMC. Sir will be speaking on topic today, Indian economy, glorious decade ahead, which I'm sure we all are waiting eagerly to have the glorious decade ahead. Over to you, Manish, sir.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. Thanks to the Academy to give me this opportunity to speak to this audience. I'm here to actually talk up my country, or rather our country. So let me start sort of giving you a sense of why I think over next few years and potentially few decades, India would actually do very, very well. And this is important because we coming out of a crisis where I mean, at least most commentaries that I hear in Indian newspapers and many analysts and economists that I talk to, they talk very, very pessimistic on India right now. So let's start with building a little bit of a prior on what kind of growth that sort of we can achieve in our country. So over the last two and a half decades, almost 25 years, we've actually grown at about 7%, 6.8% to be precise, and that should be your prior right now. Now, this is a fairly significant growth, sort of if you compare this with India's own growth previous to 1991. So for a good 4 decades, we were growing at just about 3.5%. Also, if you sort of compare this with any other country, barring some East Asian and China, our country's growth has been very, very strong. So, firstly, to build a prior on India's growth, and especially in context of the kind of pessimism that we see in our country, it's important to recognize that for all the botch-ups and mistakes that we've made over last two and a half decades, we've still been able to grow at near 7%. That's number one. Number two is important to recognize that even in last decade, which has been somewhat topsy-turvy for India. Let's say, imagine, do a thought experiment that you were actually in December 2010, you were coming out of peak of Sensex then. And if I were to tell you that India would have a policy paralysis during 2011-13, then you will have a taper tantrum led BOP crisis, then you will have demonetization, somewhat of a thing like GST, which will actually dislocate the economy. And after that, an ongoing financial crisis, which would last for 5 years and only accelerate after 2018's of IL&FS crisis. Even in a decade like that, we actually could grow at 6.5%. So it's not very difficult to imagine that if we do not have many interruptions over next decade, most probably we would actually be growing at faster than 6.5%. Okay, so that's my very, very big picture point why you as an investor or a businessman should be fairly constructive on India. And I think India would be able to deliver close to about 8% growth for the reasons that I would sort of draw now, and help you understand as to why I am so confident of India's growth. One of the reasons India actually continues to do well is because of its labor force and talent. India has a huge labor force and growing year after year. We are a young population. And unlike China, which would lose about 10, 15 crore people in next decade, India would add similar number of people in the labor force, the young who actually can do and are independent. Okay, so that's one of the reasons India would continue to do well. But I think more than that, India is an envy of world in terms of, despite being a lower income country, in terms of higher education, in terms of very well educated people, India's talent force is remarkably good because of our IITians and ISCNs of the world are technically educated STEM, science and technology students are very, very good, and that they are the people actually which are pushing the frontier. Finally, India is beginning to have an ecosystem which actually can accommodate these people, the right talent that we have in our country, and push the frontier. I myself have been experiencing this in a sense that my kid who is in 12th grade has been to some of these international Olympiads, and I happen to look at the data. I'm beginning to see that India's students are actually doing very, very well in things like physics, maths, and chemistry Olympiads, and in a sense, far better than we were doing a decade ago. So this is the workforce. I think I'm very confident. I was telling someone last night that potentially you would see many Nobel laureates, coming in the STEM field from India, of Indian origin people over the next 10, 15 years, given the kind of workforce we are supplying to the world. So that's one reason why I think India would actually drive up the growth from where we are right now. The second reason why India tends to do well and would perhaps continue to do very, very well is because of its firms. Unlike many countries that you look around, and given I'm an investor, I have looked at places like Indonesia, Philippines, even more developed countries like Taiwan. Most firms in those places are very concentrated in certain clusters. You go to Taiwan and you mostly will see semiconductor orientation and concentration in their indices. In Indonesia, it would be mostly commodity firms. But if you're an investor in India, you sort of already know that Indian indices are represented by all sorts of firms. You have good pharma firms, IT and ITES firms. You also have homegrown telecom firms. Your banking and finance, actually, and I'll just talk about it in a while, is in a very they are sort of a good firms, which have adopted the latest tech and IT systems. So in a sense, India's not just has commodity firms and the chemical firms, but also an high age and new age firms, so to say. So basically, my sense is that India again has this unique entrepreneurial class and a fairly wide variety of firms which can accommodate this talent that India produces, and which is why I think India would continue to do well. I just want to spend a minute on something that people do not appreciate much. India's office space is actually, especially for the offshoring, is the largest in the world. And if you look at almost 45 million square feet being absorbed every year, if I talk to the firms which are actually coming to India, and I have happened to talk to many of them, they sort of always make this point that India is one such place in the world relative to any Latin country or Philippines or any other country where it's very, very easy to get engineers and good quality engineers to do the research and development work also, apart from a regular commoditized ITS work. So basically we have great talent, a very large quantity of workforce, and firms, very good quality firms to absorb them. And that's why sort of I'm very, very confident that India would be able to drive up the growth in next couple of years. Then it's an important thing to recognize that all of that, talent and firms could be in place, but if you don't have good finance and good system of giving credit, a country could never grow. And one of the reasons why India has been a drag and its economy has not been able to meet its potential over the last 5 years is because India's banking has been snowed under with huge amount of NPAs. But then it's important to realize that over the last 30, 40 years, almost every decade, India has gone through this kind of a financial and credit crisis. For some odd reason, underwriting practices in the banking and the financial intermediation were not good, or our firms were far too indebted. But it's a good thing that we are beginning to change now. And while most people seem very bearish, whenever I talk to even firms like Moody's and S&P on Indian banks, or also the most analysts, the global economists also, as well as strategists, say that India's banking and finance is its Achilles heel and it's very, very weak. But then people like us, who sort of are tracking it more closely, are aware that it's beginning to change. Let me sort of list 2 or 3 things, which are beginning to change in India's banking. One, that in last 4 or 5 years, it is becoming predominantly private driven. In a sense, over last 5 years, while the stock of deposits is largely with the PSU banks, but the 70-75% of the credit is being done by the private balance sheet, where the underwriting is somewhat better. Also, while it is true that our gross NPA numbers are very high, but then mostly they are provided for right now, and incrementally the losses are unlikely to happen from those so-called stress assets as far as balance sheets are concerned. Also, India's private banks and NBFCs are fairly well capitalized relative to any other ASEAN country or any other country in the world. So in a sense, they have the capacity and capability to lend. But then there is one very important thing that an onlooker may have ignored, that somehow in India, finally India's finance or India's credit systems or India's banks have figured out who to lend to and how to lend to. Now, this is not yet a big story, but I want to share this with you that in last 4 or 5 years, the credit that Indian banks have done, despite such a huge COVID crisis, which has resulted in massive slippages across the world. And I have to tell you this, that I literally spoke to analysts across the region, be it in Philippines and Indonesia, China, and even the developed market analysts. And I am happy to share with you that India's banking in COVID has performed far, far better than most countries. It's not that we are the worst in the world. We are perhaps in the COVID crisis, our banking has perhaps done the best. And when in March, April, when I was talking to these analysts, everyone was talking of 5-6% of incremental restructured assets and gross NPAs because of COVID-19. But right now, most banks are guiding me that the credit loss because of COVID would be a percentage or so. The total restructured asset in the entire India finance, restructured asset plus gross NPA because of COVID, is just 2 to 3%. Okay, so this is the gold standard of performance in the world today, not just relative to the history. So I want you to sort of think of it that a country where its finance has gone through boom bust every decade and has resulted in 10-12% of incremental gross NPAs every time we went through a crisis. It is the first time that somehow we figured out how to underwrite, and which is why our overall NPAs are not flaring up. In fact, our balance sheets are doing all fine, and which is why one of the reason you guys are Nifty watchers and bank watchers, you would have seen how markets are repricing India's finance. So why it has happened? Because India's finance has become predominantly a retail financial franchise. About 20-25 years ago, when I entered Bombay, getting a home loan was difficult, and of the overall banking balance sheet, less than 5% used to be retail. Today, it's about 50%, which is actually retail. And retail, because it's underpenetrated in India and underlevered, it is not misbehaving the way corporate sort of credit does tend to misbehave. So the big picture, guys, is an important thing to recognize that India's finance is finally in a good shape. And I'm very, very confident that we have a capacity and capability. Firms like Bajaj Finance, HDFC Bank, these are world-class franchises and are very, very likely to expand meaningfully over the next 10-15 years. I was talking to a government official yesterday, and we were chatting about it, that I would not be surprised if India's private credit to GDP actually rises from 50-60%, right, 55-60% right now, to near 90 to 100% in about 1.5 decade, and which would mean near 20-25%, 20-22% kind of growth year after year by India's financiers. And I'm confident that something like this could happen. So I talked about India's talent, its labor force, it's a frontier economy related firms, and then finally India's finance. I think all of them combined would create a chemistry for us which can actually accelerate the growth that we've been having. And initially I made a point that even if great things are not happening in India, you would still potentially grow at 6.5-7%. But then let's sort of start to focus on something more incremental that has happened in India. And one such thing which has happened in India is India's policy. If you are actually tracking this government, especially in last 2.5-3 years, there has been tremendous reforms. Many of them have not resulted in any gains whatsoever as far as our country right now. But the GSTs, IBCs, RERAs, all of them are well known to all of you, and I'm not going to spend time on this. But even the agricultural reforms have the ability to actually take about 100 million peasant farmers from our farms to sort of urban sites and construction sites. And I think our huge problem that what happens to the agriculture if people move out, that's not existent anymore. And I'll talk about the binding constraints as far as food is concerned just in a minute. But I think there are substantial reforms which have happened in India. Also, interesting things like how the sort of traditional financiers like Indian PSU banks have been allowed, the ones who are not doing well are PCA banks now, and actually are not being allowed to sort of function. And our government is letting the private financiers grow. So all of these are great reforms, but all of them, along with substantial improvement in our logistics in index. I was talking to Cushman Wakefield analyst couple of days back, and I was surprised to hear that India's manufacturing index now, in terms of cost, is third in the world. So if you are a manufacturer of anything, India perhaps is one of the best place to come and manufacture. So as long as my government, through schemes such as PLI, right currency policy, and a reasonable ecosystem of ease of doing business, and now very, very low taxes, by the way. India's new manufacturing, the taxes are 15%, is one of the lowest in the world. I think the stage is set for a bit of a manufacturing boom in India. So I am very confident that most of the things in India over last 5-6 years, and particularly in last 3 years, the reforms which have been undertaken by our governments, actually would create a compounded effect of a spurt in growth over next couple of years. So I think finally in India, after hiatus of sorts, for a good few years, there was a policy paralysis. There are reforms, and which should assist for a reasonable growth delta in the years to come. So that's on the policy and the framework. But then there are more near-term things as well. India's traditional binding constraint on its economy has been oil. And you all know that every time oil went up, our yields went up, RBI tightened interest rates, and finally you had situation in which India growth began to slow down. But the good news is that, not just cyclically, but structurally, for reasons related to battery technology, EV and such likes, most probably oil prices have peaked, and perhaps even 10 years out, oil would not be more than $50-$60. And that's a huge advantage to India, because you all know that almost every year over the last 20 years, an average of 3.5% of our GDP was paid to the rest of the world, to the Middle East, to buy for our oil. That number now is 2.5%, would perhaps move to 1% of our GDP. So if we are saving about $40-50 billion right now in oil import, it is a huge feat. And if all of that is actually redeployed in productive capacity, in importing right technology, India could again sort of see a small spurt, or rather significant spurt in its growth. So the big binding constraint in India with respect to industry or our growth, which was oil price, is no more a binding constraint, and that's also a good news. But the final point I want to emphasize is that in the setting that we live is also likely to facilitate a super fast growth in India over next 10 years. The most important is the cheap capital. Everyone is aware, and you hear commentaries on TV and newspapers that are nifty and the markets are rallying because of cheap capital. While it is not completely true, I think they're saluting our entrepreneurs and firms, their ability to cut costs in COVID times and do very well, and good return on equities on the capital that they carry. But yes, one of the reasons why these firms are being chased and our country is likely to accelerate growth is because of cheap capital. If you've been tracking Fed and ECBs, they are committing themselves for 3, 4, 5 years of low interest rates. This is a time when good $17 trillion of bonds are actually earning negative interest rates. Market is awash with surplus liquidity, and this is not just the liquidity to go to treasuries and government bond, but this is a liquidity of high net worth individuals. There's a beautiful paper out there by Harvard University in terms of the glut of savings of rich, and I would recommend that you all read this. Basically, we are living in a world where these 1 to 5% of the people are extraordinarily rich. They have huge capital and risk capital at it, and they want to deploy places where the productivity rise and the ROEs could be high. And India is one such place, and which is why, despite all the bad, I think it's echoing. Mm-hmm. Guys, it's echoing. Can I carry on? Okay. So I think it's a signal to me that I must stop quickly. So the final point I wanted to make is with respect to capital, and I realized this, that a very substantial amount of risk capital, not just the Fed capital and ECB capital, which everyone on TV talks about, but because there is a lot of risk capital, I think the other binding constraint that a country like India faces, which is with respect to the very capital itself, because we are, by the way, as any emerging market is, a capital scarce economy or a region. So because this capital is available now, I think that too would aid India's growth. So let me summarize. Basically, I think the ingredients are in place for our country to sort of accelerate the growth. It's important to recognize that even without these ingredients, we were growing at 6.5%, 7%. And I think because of cheap capital, huge talent force, brilliant firms that we have, a policy impetus that we're beginning to see in terms of design thinking, government's focus on building infrastructure, building supply chain and manufacturing. I think the stage is set for acceleration of growth, and which is why I argue in front of all of you that India could potentially see the fastest ever growing decade in next 10, 12 years to come. We would potentially be growing at 8% plus. Today, when I talk about this, even to our policymakers, they are somewhat skeptical because they generally talk up. Of course, economists are very, very pessimistic. I think they're getting it wrong. I think we are out there to do very, very well over next 10 years. I'll pause here, and if there are some questions, we'll be happy to answer them. Thank you.
Such a wonderful talk and sharing your insights about the glorious decade ahead is actually motivating, so very motivating to hear this out on Saturday morning in times of COVID when everyone is so negative about the economy. So thank you so much for your wonderful words, sir. But someone has asked a question. I would like to put up that question. India's demographic dividend will decline in another 20 years. How can India mitigate this? Can infrastructure development and employment generation alone be factors that can reverse this wetting tide?
So really, because the person seems to understand, basically the growth is made up of productivity growth and labor force size of increase. Now, I have to tell you this, that despite the fact that we've grown at near 7% in last 10, 12 years, our labor force actually did not participate in this. And which is why this was an employment-less growth. Almost all of our growth over last 10, 12 years has happened because of the productivity growth. Now, because we are, the agricultural reforms are being undertaken, and because, the manufacturing is, the stage is set for growth in at least 12 or 13 clusters in India, I think, we would be able to absorb labor and grow. So my assessment is that, given that I did not want to talk math here, but I'm happy to sort of have conversation with people. My assessment of an 8% growth is that the productivity growth would continue at near 6.5% odd, which is what we've experienced over last 10 years also. But I am over next decade pricing an increase of labor force by 1.5% every year. Now that is the best we had during Vajpayee era. Between 2000 to 2005, our labor force actually increased. In last 10, 12 years, our labor force, despite the number of young and educated increasing, has not been participating and actually been decreasing. So, okay, first get this context right. Our labor force would increase because the literate young population would enter the labor force, but my point is that most probably they would get jobs also. Number two is that India is women do not participate in labor force. We have one of the lowest participation ratio. Over next 50 years, I would assume that our daughters and daughters would perhaps be fully occupied and doing work. Okay, so that is entirely missing middle of 50% of our population, which is whose participation is very low, would actually move into the labor force. So I think at least for three and a half decades in our country, despite the fact you're right that overall population would begin to decline after 2035, and the young population entering the labor force would begin to decline, our labor force participation will continue to improve. So while it is right that yes, in 15, 20 years time, a lot of things that you're hinting at would happen, you would continue to see more participation and therefore labor force growing. The big question for you and me, and more importantly for my policymakers, and I hope to do the same someday, is how do I get these women in work? How do I get my men to actually work in more skillful work than half employed or underemployed work that they do on their farms right now?
So, sir, I hope Akshat has got the answer. So now we have one more question from Vivek Kumar. Sir, he says if the dependence of oil reduces, the revenue of Indian government shall be much lower. Will it impact the growth?
No, it won't. In a sense, again, you've got to mute this because it's echoes otherwise. Look, one of the reform that I did not talk about, and perhaps we as people who pay and consumer who pay high pump prices, perhaps don't like it. But Indian government has been steadfastly increasing the gasoline prices and has not passed on the crash in oil prices to the consumer at all. And this is the brilliant thing that the government has done, because it has saved the resources to redeploy itself in something like, let's say, PLI, where it's going to spend 1 lakh 45,000 crore incrementally and cumulative of 2 lakh crore. It has spent that money in building roads from one place to another. Our roads are far better today, and it are ranked among top 50 in the world already, all because you could save some money from somewhere. So first of all, government revenue as a percentage of GDP, despite the crude price less than half of what it used to be, the excise duty today is higher by about a 0.5% than what it used to be. So government revenues have actually not declined. But that's okay, just a math, that, but the consumers have continued to pay from its wallet the same price equivalent to $110, $120 of crude right now, and the crude is actually $40, $45. So 1/3 the crude price, and yet your pump prices are $90 for a liter in Bombay. But is it a good news or a bad news? And I did not talk about this, that India's society has become so resilient. Can you imagine 15 years ago, some government actually imposing this kind of a fuel price in the wake of such sharp decline in crude? There would have been protest. There would have been dharnas out there. But today, this has become such a small part. And of course, the popularity of our government right now is high, that they are able to do this. But again, it talks about the very resilience, that our consumer is ready to pay much higher price contextualizing perhaps that that money is being well spent. As long as I and you don't hear of corruption cases, we are ready to give this license to our government to use the resources in an appropriate manner, even though they may increase taxes. Effectively increasing taxes on fuel has led to leakage on my wallet, and yet I've been absolutely comfortable with this. So to answer your questions on oil price, perversely, the oil price reduction has corresponded with higher excise duty, and that has led to higher revenues for the government instead of lower revenues. Okay, but then more than that, the saving from that has been deployed in more productive capacity building, and that is likely to yield better growth in the future.
Thank you so much, Manisher. Although people are still asking questions, but I think we will have to limit that. But okay, we can take last question by Bhavin Shah. If India is turning into retail lending, then who will fund our infra projects?
Guys, first let's understand, from a growth standpoint, people ask this question to me, while this is more about infra, and infra is not such a big deal. India infra spending is about 2.5%. So it's not very substantial. Large part of it is now, government sponsored, government funded, and our PPP and private ownership of infra is somewhat failed. Government has figured out that it's best to build, operate, and transfer. So we've seen sort of success in how Macquarie bought the NHI road, and now how airports are being bought by the private enterprises. The whole world, my parent, Sun Life, actually now they tell us, because they run a large infra lending team, they tell us that pretty much in Canada, the whole infrastructure is actually built by government, is operated for a few years, and then passed on to financiers and private investors. Something similar would happen in India as well. But what is interesting is that finally, for growth, it does not matter where the credit happens. It can happen to corporate balance sheet or retail balance sheet or government. Credit has to happen. Someone ought to create money and give it to some entity, one of the household or corporate or government, and that will crank up the growth. But specific to infrastructure, I think large part of infrastructure would be done by government, and as long as the sponsor is government, it doesn't matter. Banks and anyone else can continue to give it to them. They don't have to run large ALM problems.
Thank you so much, sir. And once again, I would like to thank you for being on the platform today and making our Saturday morning really beautiful with such positivity. And it's, as I'm again repeating, during this COVID times, it's lovely and wonderful to hear such positive statements from you, sir.
They were positive, but they were true. I mean, I want to emphasize that they were all true.
Yes, that is all. We are motivated. I'm sure it will act as a catalyst for all of us present here. Thank you so much, sir.